Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you to Jai and thank you to MEED for inviting me to speak today on this presentation. My name is Chung. I'm a partner at Clyde & Co, and I've been working for corporate and commercial companies in the UAE now for about over 10 years. I was invited to really speak about business resilience in a challenging environment for SMEs. And so I thought we would look to share with you what we've seen and some of the challenges we've seen and some of the key takeaways that we've seen in the last 3 to 4 months during the COVID period. It's something which I've never seen before. I came during the last great financial crisis, and this has been very different. And so hopefully, from what I say, will resonate with many of you, and it will be helpful and give you some insight into what we're seeing. I really want to talk about issues for directors and touch upon corporate governance in companies. And a lot of this is really, we get asked a lot of questions at the moment in terms of what should we do, what are our responsibilities, what are our liabilities as individuals, as well as for the company. And then we'll take a quick look at business resilience and the types of things that we believe you can do, that we see our clients doing to protect themselves against, into the future, and to look for opportunities as well. I should start by adding that it's quite a wide topic, and there's a wide range of audience who are listening at the moment, and so it's very difficult to put together something which captures everything. So this is I guess taking a step back, a general overview of what we see as being important and what matters. Okay, so the first thing is pretty much considerations for directors and what people need to do, what's important, what are the duties, obligations, some tips, and then, as we said, okay, directors' duties, understanding and exercising who is captured. Well, what we're really talking about are directors, their managers, there may be other people, shadow directors, anyone who has a decision-making role in the company. And so it's quite wide and it extends quite far. And what are these duties? Well, generally speaking, the understanding is people need to act in the best interest of the company. They need to act honestly and in good faith. You need to exercise reasonable skill and care in carrying out those duties in terms of what you do. You must avoid conflicts where you can, and where you can't, where it's not possible, those may be disclosed. And perhaps the most important thing, which you'll hear me say again and again and again today, is accounts and record keeping. It's very important to understand why decisions were made, how you did things, particularly in these difficult times. If I move on now to sort of saying, how have those things changed in the last 3 months? I think directors' duties are generally relatively easy to understand and implement when times are good, when everyone is happy, when the economy is strong. There really is no real there are fewer challenges, and we ourselves have fewer inquiries on this type of issue. But as soon as the stability changes, as long as the economic position takes a turn for the worse, the directors themselves need to start thinking about different things. Have their duties changed? And the main factor is always considering creditor interests. And the importance of a director's responsibility to its lenders, to its financiers, to its I guess to its debtors where it owes money. And directors need to consider creditor preferences, make sure you avoid transactions that undervalue where things are being moved out and can be seen to prejudice creditors' interests. And it goes without saying, avoid defrauding creditors or taking on any fraudulent activities, because the penalties can be very strong beyond that of a company. People can incur personal liability. There can be financial penalties, criminal sanctions. People can be prohibited from acting as a director again. One of the things we have seen in the last 3 months is how important access to information is. But because of how things keep developing, it's been very, very difficult to keep up with that. So, barriers to information flow, working from home is a good example where a lot of people for an extended period of time started working from home. And while there's great excitement initially and people were very productive and it all seemed great, it did make it more difficult for people to actually access information which they may need. People were used to seeing papers, people used to reading reports. Sometimes some of these things were missed out, and various directors, managers, senior management were unable to obtain the information they needed appropriately. You also saw that there's a huge amount of misinformation out there on social media elsewhere. It's very difficult to sift through that and know what is good information, what is bad information. And information being the basis upon which directors make their decisions, it is very important. Information includes both operational and financial data. And so it's important to bear in mind that while sort of the financial data is very often what we see on the credit side and in terms of liability being the most important, operational data is very important because it will tell you whether your business is able to operate, is operating at its optimum situation. And all these things lead to the adequacy of information to make informed decisions which are sensible and justifiable. Again, how these decisions are made, regular board meetings, management meetings, it doesn't matter, but the most important thing is to record. And when we say record, because ultimately if anything does go wrong, if there are any problems, it is those records which you will rely upon to justify what has happened, to show that people have acted in good faith and done everything to the best of their ability and thoughts. So, we must consider the nature of the information reviewed, whether the information obtained is sufficient, whether it is clear and good. And that goes back to that point about sifting through, making sure you do get good information. Understanding if there are conflicts, where those conflicts sit, and to try to avoid those so there can be no allegation of impropriety or giving preference to certain people. The decision-making process should be documented. And the best example of that is, we are in a situation now where there is a bit more financial stress. In these situations, very often the duties change slightly, and you need to consider the creditors as well. So the decision-making process, for example, in documents, in minutes, in resolutions, may also want to note and consider the duties and obligations to creditors. So in conclusion, and the conclusions of those thoughts should be documented as well, so that ultimately when you look back or when someone else looks back as to why something was done, they can see that everything was justified, it was clear, and from their perspective, looking at the information that is available then, because it all has been documented, it is possible for them to understand how the conclusion was justifiably reached. Ultimately, you may then need to escalate things to senior shareholders, to group executives, and we'll touch upon that in a bit later on. The management team, the executives, any officer, it really comes down to opportunities for support in these times. The first point of call will always be the internal resources that you have and where people sit. I think what our experience has been that there has been quite a big shakeup because of COVID and the environment, and so different people have taken on a number of different roles as well, and people have sort of admirably stepped in and done a very good job on the whole. So I think it's very important for businesses to look internally to see whether they're getting the maximum and most out of their employees, and whether or not they can, whether they can, I guess, retune or realign employees to provide more value and provide more support in that decision-making process. Obviously, professional advisors are also available in the market in case you want professional views, second opinions, or detailed legal ideas, detailed legal or financial views on specific projects or lines. And non-executive directors are perhaps less relevant to the SME market, but something that we are seeing increasingly taken up by companies to show that corporate governance structure, to show that that independent decision-making process, which is sensibly done. What COVID has also shown us is that most companies need to look at their corporate governance framework and see whether or not it actually works for them, whether the way of doing business, whether the way of holding meetings, passing information is suitable. There are some which are structural. For example, can structural governance, can the board of directors meet remotely? Do the articles prevent that? Do the company documents and the constitution actually say you can't do that? How can resolutions be passed in those situations? Can you hold AGMs? There was a while when it wasn't possible to do that. So all of these issues need to be looked at and worked through. I mean, it is case by case, but largely speaking, the solutions tend to be relatively simple. And then there are a number of governance obligations as well, disclosures that need to be made, and corporate actions, particularly the ones we think of where if a business has lost a certain proportion of its capital, then it needs to take certain actions to escalate those things to the shareholders, who need to then consider what is the best course of action. Can the business be rehabilitated? Is there an opportunity to grow the business again? Or should the business be placed into liquidation or bankruptcy? I think ultimately these are difficult decisions. It takes time to think through all of the information, but it is something which is very, very important to avoid financial penalties and criminal penalties. So I'll now jump through very quickly business resilience and taking steps now to protect your business for the future. And a lot of this is based on the inquiries that we have seen from our clients, about 6 months ago when sort of the real turmoil first came. The three areas that we tend to find create the most problems legally tend to be managing risk in external contract and supply chains. Obviously, if you can't get your product, if your subcontractors can't perform for you and then you can't perform, that is a disaster. There is stakeholder engagement and who the stakeholders are, from your shareholders to your employees to third parties who you're dealing with. And then I won't talk too much about it, but liquidity is the most important thing. The most important to ensure that liquidity flows, to ensure that there's enough cash coming into the business so that you can meet your obligations. Managing risk in contracts, we've looked at the whole business approach from origin until consumption, manufacturing, the logistics, and how that all works. It's important to have effectively people who are safe and people who are productive. Safety has become a very important aspect that we have all had to consider over the last 6 months. And I think giving that additional security, not just as required by law, but morally as well, when employees feel safe, they can be more productive. And these are the people who you will look to really generate a lot of your business for the future. Then there's also clarity around the external support. The government has passed various initiatives, huge initiatives to generate cash and put cash into the economy. And there is also insurance, which some businesses have taken out as a risk mitigant. And it's important to understand how those pieces can support the business in these times. Okay, then we look at managing risk in contracts. I think that the two main points that we've looked at really have been force majeure and material adverse change. We hear it all the time, material adverse change. We hear force majeure. Oh, because of COVID, it's force majeure. How does that work? Just very briefly, force majeure is actually quite complicated. It depends on the law of your contract. UAE law concepts are very different from common law contracts. The language and how those provisions are drafted matter. And basically, many of these things have timetables and strict procedures which need to be followed, where if you don't do that, it's very hard to invoke force majeure. And if you incorrectly invoke force majeure, potentially you're in breach. And a lot of times, as we have seen, a lot of people don't want to invoke force majeure at all. They accept that it's difficult for everyone, and they try and find some kind of compromise solution. And so I guess that takes on to strategies of mitigation. How do you react if you have suffered from the consequence of a force majeure event? It's really all about giving notices, giving information out, following the language in the contract, reserving your position to the best you can, and trying to find a solution. I mean, very often the legal solution is not the best solution for an operating business. It is really about looking at the situation, understanding what the commercial drivers are, and saying, are we looking to invoke force majeure, or are we looking for some kind of temporary relief? The other parts which are important are things like counterparty risk, understanding who your counterparties are, who you're relying on, their credit risk and their insolvency risk. So if you're very reliant on a key supplier and they suddenly go bust, how does that impact your business, and how do you deal with that? We've worked with a lot of businesses in looking at those contracts, advising whether those can be terminated, how they can find other contracts without unlawfully or perhaps breaching any terms of their existing arrangements. Trying to find other options. Other countries have, as borders became more difficult to cross, cross-border trade became more challenging. I mean, cargo has ordinarily flowed, but firms are now forced to ask themselves, can we live with a just-in-time strategy? Do we need a bit more buffer in there? in case of problems. Then we look at stakeholder engagement. As I've said, it's important to consider all the stakeholders who are involved. Everyone, and I think this is fair to say, everyone in the last 3 to 6 months has been desperate for information, desperate to understand what employers are doing, what their counterparts are doing, what their customers are doing. Obviously, obviously giving information out sometimes may not be appropriate, but largely speaking, keeping dialogue going so that people understand the situation and what the needs are is perhaps the most helpful aspect of managing any kind of resolution should a problem arise in the future. And to support that, there's internal and external people can help you. As I said, professionals can help you do this. Your own commercial teams will know who to speak to, and PR is also very important. I think it's worth pointing out that there are a number of companies who have not engaged with stakeholders, who have made policies on a very top-down approach, and where that hasn't been received very well by either the employees or the public at large, and they've had to go back and turn around, and that hasn't been that has wasted effort and time and damaged reputation. And perhaps the last part to touch upon now is the whole point that cash is king. Know the position now and the future. I mean, all businesses are different. Everyone will have a better feel for what the next 3 months, 6 months looks like. Hopefully it's a bit clearer now than it was 2 months ago. But a lot of it comes down to stress testing, scenario planning, and understanding what is the debt position, what the liability position, and realistically, if there is a credit problem in the future or a creditworthiness problem in the future, how is that to be managed? Does it need to be escalated to the shareholders or what? So I think that comes to the end of the presentation. So I think, sorry, I lost you briefly. I think there's a slight technical problem. So if there are any questions, please do type them in the box, and I'm more than happy to answer what I can, where I can. Okay, if there are no questions, then I suggest that there's a 25-minute networking session on now. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you use it and it's been useful for you. Thank you very much.